The Trump NLRB deals yet another blow to workers, robots as our bosses. It's here, and I'll have some thoughts on pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and much more as Labor This Week begins now. Hello, I'm Mark Harrison. President Trump's National Labor Relations Board has dealt yet another blow to workers by ruling that parent corporations of franchisees can no longer be held liable for their illegal labor practices. Now, this on the heels earlier this year of the board's ruling that corporations could not be held liable for franchisees' wage theft violations. The ruling, which is sometimes referred to as the joint employer rule, also applies to small companies who provide workers to larger corporations via subcontracting agreements. The rulings both roll back doctrines previously adopted in 2015 by the Obama administration. And the new rule still allows for the larger companies to be held liable so long as they exercise, quote, substantial and direct and immediate control over the smaller companies' employees, including their pay, benefits, hours, hiring, firing, and supervision. But that's not all going to ever happen, and actually draws a roadmap for the corporations to know exactly how not to get caught up in any kind of violation simply by assuring they never meet all of those qualifications. The ruling is significant because often small mom and pop type franchises, or say a cleaning subcontracting company, often has little or no assets. So employees whose work directly impacts the profits of the larger corporation find themselves trying to sue an empty shell of a company that has no assets. And even if the workers eventually prevail at the end of a long and expensive legal process, they often find it impossible to collect. Last week's ruling by the board is estimated to cost workers $1.3 billion in lower wages in the future. I'll be right back with a look at robot bosses. We all know robots are beginning to take our jobs. Indeed, it is estimated that up to 40% of today's jobs will be in some way replaced by artificial intelligence over the near and medium terms. And it is also expected that while these marvels of science will be slowly introduced, at some point their final takeover of the workplace will be swift and severe. But what about right now? There is indeed an insidious threat already underway that has us working harder and being held increasingly more responsible for unmet work goals. They are, in essence, replacing that middle manager you always love to hate, and they are taking away many workers' ability to relax if for only a moment. Computer-driven algorithms are monitoring warehouse workers, hotel maids, delivery drivers, and call center employees who are being told, for example, what to say based on what customers are saying and immediately redirected to new calls when that customer hangs up. Don't answer your call because you had to take care of a biological need? Too bad. You're going to hear about it and possibly get your pay docked because of it. Over at Amazon, being a warehouse worker and packer is one of the most physically difficult jobs around because humans are now being held to an impossible algorithm derived by computers that see many of them held to such a high physical standard that they simply break down. Indeed, in a recent study, many workers are saying fear of robots taking their jobs is being replaced with the fear of having to work for one. We'll be right back. The White House said last week that it would veto the PRO Act should that Proworker Act land on the president's desk in this Congress. The PRO Act was recently passed in the U.S. House of Representatives and is designed to protect workers' rights and calls for such reforms as modernizing the definition of unfair labor practices and protecting workers who try to unionize. The act would also take strides in helping unions collect dues in so-called right-to-work states. Make America great again, so long as it doesn't affect the corporate bottom line. Staying with the president for a moment, new data shows that business investments have now declined for 3 straight quarters. The president had promised that the billionaire tax cut he championed in Congress would become economic rocket fuel for the economy, But it seems the only rockets it has fueled have been for the wealthy. Now, I was going to talk about the stock market being rocket fueled, but apparently that rocket's about to re-enter the atmosphere. Led mostly by teachers, who have become examples for all of us when it comes to speaking with one voice, more Americans are now going on strike. The past 2 years have seen more strikes across the nation than at any time since the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers. There were 10 strikes last year, including the 6-week strike by the UAW at General Motors and strikes by teachers in North Carolina, West Virginia, Los Angeles, Chicago, Kentucky, and Oregon. As well, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, CWA 9119, AFSCME, Local 3299, and if you've been watching the show for long, you'll know that workers at IBEW 3 in New York City remain out on strike against Spectrum Charter for more than 3 years now. Staying with the Spectrum strike, the City of New York has just said that the corporation will be allowed to continue operating its cable TV and internet systems in the city beyond the time of its expiration this coming summer. Members of IBEW 3 had been hoping there was enough evidence to decline that franchise agreement to Spectrum Charter. The news comes as a blow to striking members, but continues a pattern by the mayor and other local, state, and federal politicians talking one way, but acting another. I'll be back in a moment with some thoughts on how pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps is going. A recent study by the United Nations warned that income inequality is destabilizing the world's democracies. Inequality is eroding trust in societies and giving rise to authoritarianism and nativism. Historically, those aren't recipes for success for anyone. Well, except perhaps the very rich who profit from chaos. The report calls for solutions like social safety nets, the redistribution of wealth, and the protection of workers' rights. But in the United States, the suggestion of those solutions for decades now has fallen on deaf ears in Washington. In fact, what we hear more often than not, what we have always heard, in fact, is take responsibility for yourself, find a way, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Really? Citing examples of a very few, many of the haves in our nation take pride in explaining how their grandfathers built a life by sweeping floors and putting themselves through night school. They like to say that if he could do it, anyone could do it. But if we probe a little deeper, we would find that what some people considered coming from nothing is quite different from what others view as coming from nothing. Growing up in a family that is abuse-free, drug-free, where there are 2 parents to share child care is a privilege, any way you slice it, money or not. Many people in my generation had a stay-at-home mother in their earliest years that gave a stable feeling to their homes. Hot meals in the morning and at night go a long way in allowing a child to think about a future, to consider options, to think about the impact of school and grades and college. But in far too many homes around our country, the loss of well-paying jobs with benefits and the transition to a life of hopelessness have led to terrible consequences. Do you know, in Ohio recently, there was a serious discussion about building a second morgue to house all the bodies being brought in due to deaths from opioid overdoses. That's not normal. No one is pulling themselves up by the bootstraps in a town that is that lost, a town that is that left behind, a town where no one over 40 can make sense out of the lives they currently have, the futures they currently face, compared to what once seemed possible. Things happen very quickly when the local plant shuts down. Local businesses fail, savings dry up, property values decline, savings once slated for children's educations and a family week or two spent at the shore or in the mountains cease to exist. Parents withdraw, they divorce, turn to legal and illegal drugs in last efforts to make sense of it all. And many die shortened lives from abuse or obesity or both. And in the inner cities, that haven't been gentrified to death, coming home to an insect and rat-infested apartment or a house when no one is home and the streets are a dangerous place, children aren't thinking about doing their homework. They're thinking about their empty stomachs and whether an exhausted family member will even come home tonight after working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs just to feed them. The refrigerator is empty, the house is cold, and they need a coat. In this country, those of us who have severely underestimate the reality of the millions who don't. There are no bootstraps to be pulled. There is only survival. Every single day, over and over again, for far, far too many of us. I'm Mark Harrison. I'll see you again next week.